Chapter 32. Beta? No, that's impossible. I sat staring at Elder Luke in disbelief, unsure if he really had just suggested that. Why? Elder Luke argued. Because I'm a female, I pointed out. There is no such thing as a female. Beta. It's not a rank we can hold. And neither is an alpha female, but we both know you could claim that authority if you really wanted it. He was referring to my new title of Saintess. With it came the perk of overthrowing Aelric and becoming essentially an alpha in the process. But, Beta? I paused in thought. No, it really wasn't possible. Being a leader was one thing. I knew I would be capable of making the correct choices for the pack as an alpha. However, as a beta, there was more reliance on being able to carry out whatever those orders entailed, usually by means of fighting. I had never even managed to win in a fight against Kai. There was no way I would be able to hold my own in a real battle. I'm not strong enough. The Winter Mist would need someone more like my father to replace him one day. I know already that I would make an incredibly weak beta. He half smiled knowingly. A little birdie told me that you were training with a certain alpha heir from the Silver Lake pack and mentioned that you showed quite good potential too. My jaw opened in surprise. How could someone have found out about that? Only Kai, Myra, and I knew about it. Not only that, but whoever this person was that told him, they must have seen me in action at the gym. Otherwise, how else were they able to provide any sort of assessment of my skill? How? I finally managed to ask. He chuckled softly. I didn't get to where I am today without help. Not all of us are born into ranked families. I had never thought much about it before, but it was true. I could vaguely remember hearing that Elder Luke had come from a completely average house with humble beginnings. He had gotten to where he was now due to his own dedication and hard work. Even if I can fight a little, there is no way I would be accepted as a beta, I said, bringing the conversation back to the topic at hand. I don't see any way the elders or Aelric would allow it. The elders are adamant about me fulfilling the prophecy and becoming Alaric's Luna. And Aelric? Well, there is no way he would tolerate a female beta, let alone being stuck with me of all people. You talk as if you already know exactly what will happen, he said, making me become instantly tense. I had to remind myself that it was just a figure of speech to relax again. I feel that you need to think about this more objectively. Out of all the options you have before you, which one seems the hardest to achieve your goal? Starting a political takeover and overthrowing an existing hierarchy? Or convincing a bunch of old coots and a teenager to give you a chance for a role that already has a current vacancy for an heir? Think you'd be surprised by how many elders would be in favor of you becoming beta just to ensure you remain compliant. Seems to me like it is the best compromise to keep both parties happy. Otherwise, there isn't much to stop you from starting a rebellion or running away, both of which would only cause more damage to the pack. They need your cooperation given your status. I bit at my lip, trying to think through the options properly. Still felt so unattainable, even though he had laid it out nicely before me. Or you can just take the easy route. Suck it up and become Luna. I shivered. No. To hold that title again would be a last resort, though I wasn't sure I could even call it that. To be stuck in that house at the mercy of Aelric once more was a fate that guaranteed my death. A death that I needed to remember was not just the end of me now, but possibly everyone. So would it be so impossible? I had already been training and there were no males in my direct family line to compete with for the rank. Only Alexander, my cousin, could possibly stand in my way. In the past, he had begun his training around my age and had ended up becoming beta right before my death. If I was, by some miracle, accepted as a beta heir, then things between us may get uncomfortable. I was essentially robbing him of something he must have. That was a sure thing. How could he have anticipated that a female beta may be possible? But if I were a male, then he would have had no right to the succession anyway. And then I took a moment to realize the real benefits of this. Becoming beta basically guaranteed me almost absolute immunity in every way. By pledging myself as a beta to Aelric, it would be impossible to be forced to become Luna by anyone. Once the oath is taken, another rank cannot be granted within that pack. It also gave me a legitimate reason to officially reject him without questions being asked, since dating what is effectively your boss would be frowned upon. If we went into battle against another pack, then we would need to be unbiased towards each other, therefore a relationship was definitely out of the question. But the best perk of all? It meant that he couldn't lay a finger on me. Being both a saintess and a beta would make me completely untouchable. If he tried anything, then he'd risk the pack rising up against him, since it would be seen as a direct attack against the goddess herself. Then add in the fact that I was already second in command. He could forget keeping his position for long. And then guess who would replace him as next in line? Me. It was effectively checkmate, unable to move or he'd be overthrown. And maybe for once in his life he would have to respect me. Not just a ridiculous nod of acknowledgement, but actually value my input. He would be unable to outrightly contest, without good reason, the decisions I'd suggest, and would be forced to have a real discussion with me as a valued ranked member. No. You're right. Thank you, Elder Luke, I said, still a bit lost in my thoughts. You've given me a lot to think about. Soon after we'd spoken, I ended up returning home. I didn't talk to my parents about what had happened in great detail, but I did let them know that the mark was officially confirmed now. They looked worried for me, but I didn't let on how I was feeling inside. If they knew just how conflicted and anxious I was, they would only become more concerned. I didn't want to say anything to them yet until I'd had time to process everything that had happened with Elder Luke. Several weeks later, and it was finally the day of Myra's big annual charity event. I'd chosen to wear a navy blue semi-formal dress, and Lucy had done my hair up in a beautiful half-up style braid. It was probably the most I'd dressed up for any occasion since coming back, but I knew the event meant a lot to Myra, and I wanted to show her I'd put the effort in. The function was being held at the orphanage itself, so the children could participate. Whilst it was used mostly as a fundraiser, it was also a great opportunity for some of the guests to meet the children in a less pressured environment and maybe even consider adopting. I had already planned to donate a large check under my alias name and another smaller one on behalf of the Chrysalis family, with my parents' permission to use the family's money for that one, of course. Knowing Myra would have made me take the money back if she knew if I was donating a very large sum I had to use my private account for my personal donation. When I arrived, I was instantly greeted by the usual overly enthusiastic Myra. She pulled me into a hug and expressed how happy she was to see me. Much to my delight, I saw she was wearing the red dress I had bought her the other day. But I had to admit, I was a little surprised to have found her so quickly, given the number of people congregating around the outside. Come with me, I have some people I'd like you to meet, she said, smiling, grabbing my hand so I'd follow her through the crowds. We walked behind the large building until we came to a less busy area. I could see this place must have been used primarily as a playground or backyard for the kids. I had been looking around to take it all in, lost in my thoughts over how pretty the grounds were, when I was suddenly tackled around my waist. Swayed, throwing my feet out to keep my balance, and looked down. There I found a small child had launched themselves at me. Billy, Myra scolded, gently pulling him off me. You need to ask permission first to touch someone. Apologize to Miss Aria right now. I felt awkward given I had no experience with children, and I definitely hadn't anticipated for one to have latched themselves onto me so quickly. But I did my best to act the way one would expect to treat a child. I'm sorry, Miss Aria, the small blonde boy said, looking sad. It's fine. Thank you for apologizing. I smiled at him to let him know it was okay. Suddenly more children appeared, and before long I had a small group of 6 kids surrounding me, their faces filled with so much excitement over just meeting me. Myra went through and introduced them all to me one by one. The eldest in the group was 9, the youngest was 6. Myra mentioned there was more around somewhere, and that they would probably be disappointed to find out later they hadn't gotten the chance to meet me personally. Miss Aria? A little girl named Lily spoke up. I crouched down to talk to her at eye level. Yes, Miss Lily? My name is just Lily, not Miss, she corrected. I was wondering if you'd like to play with us. Miss Aria is not here to play today, Lily, Myra replied. I smiled at them both. No, it's okay. What would you like to play? I want to play tag, said one of the boys, Trevor. The children all began to cheer in agreement at that idea. And so we did. I couldn't deny that it definitely wasn't the easiest game I'd ever played, given my attire, but luckily they found it more fun when I was too slow to catch them, or rather pretended I was too slow. By the end of the game they were all huddled together in the middle of the field, completely out of breath. Taking advantage of their exhausted states, I decided to take a seat under one of the nearby trees that luckily had a bench. "Looks like you had fun," Myra said. She had spent the time looking fondly at us playing together over by the sidelines. I had been watching the kids chatting away happily that I hadn't even seen Myra approach. "You should join in next time." I looked up to her, but then to my surprise, I saw her expression change from a smile to suddenly one of worry. Quickly, "Are you okay, Arya?" she asked. Her voice was thick with concern. I frowned. "Of course, why? You're crying." Confused, I gently brought a hand up to my face, and sure enough there were tears on my cheek. "What? Are you feeling okay?" she asked. Was I feeling okay? I had been having a nice time with the children. I wasn't sure what could have possibly upset me so much. And then I realized what my body had been trying to tell me. I looked down and saw I had subconsciously placed a hand over my belly without even realizing. I must have done it when I had been watching over the kids. I then knew what had upset me. A part of me was remembering the fact that I would never be able to have a child of my own. I was crying over the baby I had never been able to conceive in my past life. "Oh," was all I managed to say. But I didn't get a chance to talk my way out of it, as suddenly all the children were in a frenzy again over someone who had arrived. I pushed all my negative thoughts to the side, and I forced a small smile on my face, seeing how they were able to become energetic again so quickly. However, the expression died on my face just as quickly as it had arrived as I looked over to see who they were running towards. Because it was Aelric who had arrived. Chapter 33. "Stop them," my mind hissed at me as I watched the children laugh and jump all over Aelric. He had scooped a few up and was playing happily with them. They ran around him, tugging at his clothes, as he pretended to be a scary monster. Every time he would roar, they would all squeal and run a few steps away, having the time of their life. "He is a murderer," my mind reminded me. "He is dangerous. Don't let him touch them." But the scene in front of me was baffling, freezing me in place. I had never seen Aelric around children before, and so his affectionate behavior to them was shocking, to say the least. Would he have been like this in the past if he'd had a child of his own? If my body had been capable of such a thing? As the thoughts urging me to protect the children continued to hound at me, I did my best to push them away. I had to remind myself that a 16-year-old Aelric was not yet the man he would be one day. He didn't have blood on his hands yet. Myra could sense I was suddenly extremely uncomfortable at his arrival and gently touched my hand. She probably didn't understand, but it was nice of her to try and comfort me regardless. Finally, Aelric looked up towards the tree and saw us sitting there. Flinched as his eyes caught my own, and then to my dismay he immediately put down the kid that was thrown over his shoulder and started to walk to where we were. My heart started to race, but I told myself I was more mentally prepared. This time, I wouldn't let the trial ground memories haunt me like the last time. I took several deep breaths, calming my mind, but with every step he made towards us, the more I began to doubt my ability to handle it. Would I actually be able to keep it together this time? It had been so many months now since I'd seen him. So many months since I had died. Would the memories still be as fresh? But as he stood in front of me, I realized just how weak and insignificant I still was. He towered over my small frame, and I knew that, even with all of the training I'd done over the last few months, it would still not even be remotely good enough to defend myself against him. "Ariadne, Myra," he greeted. His voice made my stomach drop, and I instantly felt sick and weak. My name on his lips felt more like a curse. Myra and I were both already on our feet by this point, and we bowed our heads in respect upon his greeting. "Alpha Heir," Myra said, welcoming him. "We are honored to receive you at our event today. Thank you for coming." I couldn't get the words out of my mouth to return his greeting, my head pounding at the internal conflict happening within. I was sure he had noticed my silence, though. He had to have. Aelric smiled. "It is a pleasure to be here and to finally meet you, Myra. My father extends his regards for the invitation this year and wishes to thank you for your family's continued hard work at the facility." I couldn't bring myself to look at his face, choosing to keep my eyes cast down. It was taking all of my concentration just to not visibly shake from just being so close to him. "Thank you, Alpha Heir." Myra bowed again quickly. However, unfortunately, it seems I will need to find you later to talk further. I have some matters to discuss with Ariadne right now. I look forward to catching up properly, and please let your parents know that I have arrived. My breath stopped mid-exhale from surprise. Why would he need to talk to me of all people? I could feel Myra hesitate for a second, but we both knew there was nothing she could do to help me here. With one last final bow, she left, looking back several times with a worried expression. And then somehow I was facing the man who still haunted my nightmares. Alone. An icy silence hung between us. Are you going to at least talk to me this time? He asked, finally breaking the quiet. Or should I call for Caius to come back and whisk you away again? It was like his facade of being polite in front of Myra had instantly fallen like a curtain. Now that it was only the two of us, he became closer to the Elric I knew, unnecessarily cruel, and occasionally sarcastic to the point of trying to put me down. I grabbed at my wrist to stop it from trembling. I needed to be stronger than this. I needed to be able to at least speak to him. He sighed in mild frustration, his tone suddenly changing. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't ask to talk with you in order to start an argument. I could see him cross his arms together and shuffle on his feet. It was as if he was uncomfortable with how to say whatever it was he needed to say. The truth is, he continued, my father informed me of what happened with Myra and the Jade Moon Pack. I realize I need to apologize for how I acted after you'd met with the council. So, I am sorry, Ariadne. You had been badly injured, and it was no way for me to have spoken to you. This caught me off guard. Elric was apologizing to me for something he had said? I couldn't ever recall a moment in our past he'd done such a thing. But all of that aside, I'm here to request that you have tea with me. My eyes then snapped to his face, wide in disbelief. Why would he, of all people, want to willingly have tea with me? I didn't have to wait long for my answer, though. Or rather, my father suggested that we have tea together, he clarified. There is still a few hours before the main event for the fundraiser, and he's asked if you could lend me some of your time. I needed to speak, to say something. Anything. I feebly said before clearing my throat. I'm sure you have far more important things that require your attention today, Alpha Air. I would hate to keep you from those. His green eyes narrowed at me, and I instantly looked back down again. Sorry if I didn't make it clear enough before, he said. But this wasn't really a suggestion from my father. He's actually insisted on this. I then understood the meaning behind his words. This wasn't an innocent request, this had been an order from his father. We were both now bound to abide by the Alpha's wish. And so, that's how I suddenly found myself sitting for some tea opposite the man who murdered me. It was a bit of a surreal experience. The last time we had sat together as just the two of us for a meal had been not long after our rise to Alpha and Luna. Though back then he had stared daggers at me the entire time and left after 20 minutes to go see Thea. A small area in the adjacent garden had been set up specifically to enable us to have a private gathering. The outdoor table and chairs had already been a part of the decor, however, some attendants had gone out of their way to make the area look more suitable. Flowers had been picked and arranged in a vase on the table, and a trolley next to this showed off a large array of tea and snacks that had been prepared. Surrounding us was also a mixture of colorful flowers and fauna growing in the garden, all perfectly maintained. It really would have been beautiful if it weren't for the company I would be keeping. But after several minutes had passed, still neither of us had spoken a single word to each other. I knew what this setup was, of course. Alpha Titus was forcing Aelric and I to spend time together so we'd hopefully play nice and become close. This was probably some weird version of a surprise date in the hopes I'd concede to becoming his Luna one day. He probably assumed, and correctly so, I would decline to a real meetup, and so chose to force us to participate during a time we would both already be dressed up and close by. I wondered how many more of these dates I was going to have to endure before they finally respected my choice not to be with him. Aelric then cleared his throat, bringing my attention back to him. So, my father wanted me to thank you for your recommendation over handling the Jade Moon Pack, he started, breaking the silence finally. It turned out to be quite successful in the end. He said your actions during the fight and your solutions for handling the aftermath were quite commendable. I nodded. Thank you, Alpha Air. Silence again. All I could think about was the seconds as they slowly ticked by. I wanted nothing more than to run far, far away from here. Is the food not to your liking? He asked, noticing my plate. You've barely touched anything. I looked down at the small piece of cake that sat in front of me with only 2 tiny bites taken out of it. The entire time we'd been sitting together I had been so nervous that I'd barely been able to eat or drink from the spread provided. I wouldn't have been able to even tell him the flavor of anything I'd consumed so far. I hadn't been able to taste a single thing from the stress of being in this situation. The food is delicious, I lied, having no idea. Thank you, Alpha Air. It was clear his father had ordered him to talk nicely to me. They both probably realized they needed me on their side, and Titus would have known how his son's usual behaviors would have been perceived by me. Ulrich wasn't exactly known for his patience. But, if I was honest, the forced attempt at trying to talk politely to me was by far one of the most unnerving experiences I'd ever had. Never had I received any courtesy from Ulrich before, and so this new persona of his was unpredictable to me. I found Ulrich far less frightening when I could tell exactly what he may do next. He sighed abruptly and brought his hand up so fast my body couldn't help but react, flinching at his sudden movement. He frowned at me but continued to brush the hair out of his face, finding my reaction strange. The teacup in my hand had almost completely spilled all over myself in my fright. Are you unwell? He asked. He could see how much my hands were trembling now. No, I stuttered out, cursing internally at my body for betraying how I felt. Thank you for your concern, Alpha Air. Ariadne, I can see you're shaking, he said. He stood up and went to reach for me. Here, just put this down for I didn't hear whatever he was about to say though, because I recoiled so quick from him that the plate in front of me smashed against the trolley and fell to the ground in pieces. My arm had swept across the table so fast that there hadn't been any time to stop it from falling. I turned and stared up at him in a panic, petrified of what he would do to me for my show of carelessness. I wanted to apologize, to beg him to forgive me, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. Nothing would pass my lips as a coherent sentence. Ariadne, he said in an annoyed tone. And then he reached towards me again, and I turned my face to the side, shutting my eyes as tightly as they would go to anticipate whatever he was about to do to me. But nothing ever came. It felt like an eternity waiting before I finally heard him sigh again. I carefully opened my eyes to look at him, but cautiously as to not anger him further. He was rubbing his eyes in frustration, clearly irritated over everything I'd just done. Okay, I tried. I thought I heard him whisper under his breath. He looked back up at me, forcing a smile on his face, and stood up. A chill went down my spine at seeing that familiar smile. I knew it so well. The kind that said he was hiding his true emotion from me. Thank you for your time today, Ariadne, he said, going back to being overly polite. It was an absolute pleasure. I hope we can do this again sometime. It was all a lie and we both knew it. He was following formality to not incur the wrath of his father when he returned home. He waited several seconds for me to reply, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. It was only after I eventually managed to give him a half bow of my head in acknowledgement that he took it as good enough confirmation to take his leave. I sat staring into space for a long time after he left, unsure how to process everything that had just happened. I felt just like the broken plate that laid shattered next to me, both of us having no idea how we became like this, but both feeling like only minutes ago everything had been just fine. I thought I was ready, that I was stronger now, but I was wrong. It was clear that Ulrich was still so very much in control of me, and there was only one way I was going to be able to change it. There was now no other options. I needed to become untouched. Chapter 34. Despite my resolve, it still took another 2 months before I finally worked up the courage to begin the difficult journey of becoming beta. The rest of Myra's charity event had gone well that day, and I didn't see Ulrich for the remainder of the fundraiser, which was perfectly fine by me. Could tell Myra was a bit worried about me though, and I had to palm it off as no big deal, so I didn't worry her. It was her first time seeing me so scared by anything, and I could only imagine what might have been going through her mind. In the 2 months that had passed, I somehow had reached my 15th birthday. I requested that it be kept a quiet affair, and so we ended up celebrating it with just my parents and Myra. There were minimal gifts also, per my request, and we all sat and had a nice dinner at my house. Really, I was just happy to be amongst all the people who genuinely cared about me. There were too many birthdays in the past I had spent almost completely alone and forgotten. And so finally today, I stood at the door of my father's office peering in, nervously. He was concentrating on reports in front of him and I was scared of disturbing him. From here I could see his silver hair and violet eyes, and I thought about how similar we really did look. If it weren't for me having mostly my mother's face shape, then I would have looked like a cut and pasted female version of him. I can feel you staring at me from here, he called out without even looking up from his work. I jumped at the sound of his voice, having not expected him to know I was here. He looked up and finally met my eyes. What can I help you with, Arya? I stepped inside the door cautiously, clearing my throat. I need to talk to you, Father. Do you have a moment? I could hear the slight quaver in my voice as I spoke. I needed to get a hold of myself, though. I wouldn't be able to convince him I was suitable for this if I didn't sound like I believed it myself. But it was a bit strange how nervous I was. Exploiting a foreign government for money? No. Issues. Asking my father to hear me out while I explained why I wanted to be a beta? Terrifying. His opinion mattered to me and I didn't want his perception of me to change because of this. It didn't help that I was also having to constantly remind myself that this version of my father was different from the one I had been with before my death. He was almost 10 years younger than the father that had cried with me inside the jail cells. At this point in our lives right now, our relationship was very formal. I remembered how scared I had been of ever disappointing or annoying him, a feeling that didn't change up until he had himself arrested for defending my honor. He looked at me closely, a curiosity in his eyes. Sure, take a seat on the couch. I followed his instruction and he walked over to join me, sitting like this, together casually on the settee. I honestly couldn't tell if it made me feel comfortable or even more nervous. Perhaps if I could have treated this as a business negotiation and sat across from him at his desk, then I wouldn't be so afraid. You haven't come to my office like this since you were little, he mused. Did you want some tea? I shook my head, knowing I wouldn't be able to drink at a time like this. I couldn't even recall the last time I had dared to disturb his work, but I knew I procrastinated this conversation long enough. Time was running out if I wanted to be given a chance to earn my spot as beta heir. I also knew I would need help for training if I had any hope of improving my skill in a fight. I'd reached a plateau and hadn't seen any real difference in my strength for over a month now. I realized the only way I was going to get better from here would be to have someone show me how to improve, and with Kai gone, it meant there really was only one person in my life that could help. My father. I watched as he poured himself a tea and settled back into the couch. So, what did you want to talk about? I hesitated, unsure where to start. I'd practiced what I had wanted to say in the mirror almost every day, but now it was actually happening. It was like my mind had gone blank. I started. Brilliant, Arya. So intelligent. I pushed my thoughts away, trying to refocus. I've been thinking a lot about the future, I said. We haven't really had a conversation about it since the night after the Alpha summons when Myra was attacked. He raised an eyebrow at me. Did you want to finally discuss why you told the Alpha you didn't want to become Luna? Why you kept your mother and I in the dark about your intentions? I paused. It sounded like he was still irritated about the whole thing. Could recall the argument we got into that night vividly and remembered how they had been so furious at my decision. It had scared me off enough to start keeping more secrets from them. It wasn't my intention to hide it from you, I said. I hadn't planned to tell the Alpha anything of the sort, but this mark on me changed everything. Needed to establish that I wasn't a threat to Titus or Aelric. But Father, I need you to know that from the bottom of my heart. I really don't want to be Luna. What I said to them that day was the truth. I really am sorry I kept it from you and Mother. I almost said don't want to be Luna again, but managed to stop myself right before I spoke. What a disaster that would have been. Why? He finally asked after he'd taken some time to think. I don't have any desire for the position. He frowned. I doubt you would have come all the way in here to tell me this without a reason. There is obviously something else you wanted to ask. I bit my lip, my nerves threatening to take over. The truth is, I'd like to take over for you one day and become beta, I said slowly. To his credit, he didn't outwardly refuse me immediately. He nodded his head, placing his teacup back on the table, and reclined into the couch in thought. I was too scared to say anything in case it just made his rejection quicker. After some time he looked over to me and stared down at my hands, narrowing his eyes. So for how long now? He asked. I didn't know what he was referring to. How long? Your hands, he said, nodding towards them. I've just realized how calloused they look. How long have you been training in secret? It was a question that would have been answered eventually, but nevertheless, I wish it had been something he only found out about if he had agreed to support me. I tightened my hands into fists on my lap, staring at them. Maybe 8 months now. I started not long after the alpha summons. He was silent again. I wished he would just talk plainly to me instead of making me guess whatever he was thinking inside. It was excruciating. So, this is something you've taken a few months in deciding to pursue then? It wasn't exactly correct. I had started training with the original intent of defending myself from Aelric, not for the purpose of becoming beta. But it was true I had spent the last 2 months thinking through my options thoroughly. This was something I wanted to do. Something that I needed to do. I've weighed all of my options with great care, Father, I replied. This is the only choice I have that allows me to both refuse the Luna position and protect myself from those threatened by my mark. He was silent once again. I can see why you may think I might not be worthy, I finally said after he hadn't said anything for an extended period of time. I understand that you would want to see me succeed, and becoming Luna would be viewed as the highest honor for your daughter to achieve. I also realize that being a female, you may think I'm not up to the task. I looked up to meet his eyes and saw he was looking at me, a crease between his brows. Arya, you don't need to become a Luna for your mother and I to be proud of you, he said. I also don't care whether you're a male or female. To me, any child of mine naturally has a right to succeed me as the beta. My heart leapt at hearing his words. I was pleased to know his stance on my position hadn't changed in 10 years. He really did care. Had the wall between us my whole life been only something I had created in my mind the entire time? Thank you, Father, I said wholeheartedly. I felt out of breath. It was a relief to finally hear the words from him, to know that he supported me. But Arya, he continued, his tone serious, I'm disappointed that you kept this from me from us. I thought you understood how much we didn't appreciate you cutting us out after last time. Keeping secrets from me was not the way to gain my support in this. I froze. Had I really made a mistake in how I'd handled it? This entire time I thought I was doing the right thing, scared of what they might think of me if I told them of my real desires and worries. A beta is someone trustworthy, someone who can be relied upon, he said. Someone who is able to fight and support those around them as a team. Your actions have shown me that you prefer to work alone without the support of your fellow pack. I don't see how others will respect and follow you when you refuse to be transparent in your motives. You need more than intelligence to be a leader, Arya. If I felt like I was out of breath before, then it really felt like I was drowning now. I had always worked alone, always from the shadows forgotten, but having him say it outright like this made it extremely clear the barriers I'd made around myself were in complete contrast to the person I needed to be in order to become beta. I hadn't opened myself up enough to others, wanting to avoid putting myself in a vulnerable position to be hurt or rejected again. I could see now how my attempts at protecting myself could actually hold me back in my pursuit of becoming beta. I glared down at my hands, unable to look at him, and could feel the start of angry tears begin to bubble at my eyes. I was furious at myself for not realizing earlier how my father would view the decisions I'd made. There was no way for him to have known why I was the way I was. So, Arya, he said, breaking me from my thoughts, are you going to tell me the truth now? I quickly looked up at him, confused. If you want my support, then it's about time you start being honest with me. But I've been truthful. I've told you finally what I've been doing and how. I don't want to be Luna, I replied. He exhaled slowly, obviously disappointed in my answer. Well, to start with, you could tell me about what happened to you 10 months ago, when I suddenly found out my daughter had been marked by the goddess. Something that, for generations now, we had all grown up thinking was Just a myth. And then I realized what truth he wanted. He wanted to know what had happened to me, why I had changed so much in such a short amount of time, why I was no longer acting like the quiet, diligent daughter I had been my entire life. In order to become Beta, I would need to tell my father about my past. And Chapter 35. I could feel the tears begin to fall down my face and I shook my head.
No.
I can see, I said, gritting my teeth. I could see it all again so clearly. The cells, my father, the trial ground, the sword, and Aelric. I realized then that a part of the reason I hadn't told anyone about my past before now wasn't just because I needed to keep myself safe, but because I couldn't talk about it before. It was too painful. It felt like if I said the words aloud, then it would be making it real. And if it was real, then there would be no way I could even remotely say that. Maybe, just maybe, my past life had been just a bad dream. Arya, you need to be honest and upfront with me now if I'm going to be backing you up here. The journey for you to become a Beta will be hard enough as it is. It's not that simple, I said, still shaking my head in denial. You need to trust me when I say I can't become Luna, that becoming Beta is the only way forward.
Arya.
No, he said sharply and began to raise his voice, irritated that I was still deliberately being difficult. Enough is enough. I will not help you until you tell me the truth. So what the hell happened, Arya? Why won't you tell me? Because I died, father, I yelled, cutting him off. I died. The words had fallen out of my mouth before I could stop them, but once they were finally out, they hung in the open between us, never to be taken back again. As soon as I'd said them, though, I gasped at the air, a weight lifting from me for telling the truth, finally allowing me to breathe again. What? His face was beyond confused, having been taken aback by what I'd just told him. I've lived this before already. All of this, I said through my tears and heaving breaths. I became Alaric's mate, I became the Luna. I even helped lead us all to become the country's most powerful pack there ever was, just as the elders predicted. I did everything that was ever asked of me. But it wasn't enough, father. I wasn't enough. I don't understand. His eyes were wide. This probably wasn't the sort of confession he had been expecting. How could I wanted to explain further, to give him the kind of explanation he could understand, but instead all I could do was break down in front of him, my body crumbling into complete heart-wrenching sobs. He didn't love me, Daddy, was all I could choke out. He didn't love me. It was the words that been ingrained in my mind for too long. Since coming back, I had told myself multiple times that my past feelings for Aelric didn't bother me anymore, that I didn't care. But the truth was, even though this body didn't know yet of the void left by Alaric's physical rejection, I still remembered. I still remembered the excruciating pain of being hurt every single day I lived in that hell, years before he even rejected me officially. The kind of pain that could only arise from loving someone with your entire being. I was no longer able to stop the flood of emotions coming up all at once, and I was sure my father had no idea what was going on, but he must have understood enough to see that whatever it was I was trying to tell him, it was enough to cause me to be in this much emotional distress just from talking about it. He pulled me into his arms and held tightly onto me as I cried against him. Everything had spilled out of me all at once. Things I had sworn to never tell anyone, things I didn't think I would ever be able to share with someone. But I didn't care anymore if he thought I was insane. I couldn't live like this. Shoo, Arya, he soothed. It's okay. I just clung to him tighter, burying my sobbing face further into his chest. Please, help me, Papa. He didn't say anything else after that. He just held me in his arms until I'd exhausted myself. I was grateful that he didn't push the topic again for that night. By the time I had finished shedding every last tear in my body, he just picked me up and took me to bed. It was a moment that I was glad I was still small enough for him to carry me as he did, knowing that there was no way I would have been able to rely on my legs again for that day. And when we finally got to my bedroom, he stayed with me as I continued to cling to him for dear life. He stayed with me until finally I drifted to sleep. It was a blessing. I was too exhausted to dream that night. As expected, the next morning my father was obviously wanting an explanation for what had happened the night before. And so I told him. I told him everything. And the more I spoke, the more that poured out of me, and soon I found that I couldn't stop myself from giving every little detail. I told him how I had ended up as Luna and how I'd become a Larix blade in his war against the world for power, how I had so desperately fought for his love, only for it to have been given to another. And lastly, I told him about the trial, how we'd said our final goodbyes in the cells, and how Aelric had finally killed me. He was silent the entire time, taking in every word I said and never interrupting. But by the time I finally finished, I looked up to my father and saw a few tears had escaped his eyes, something I had only seen him do once before, right before I had died. Having confessed about my prior life to my father, I felt liberated at last. Now had someone I knew I could rely on completely, and who would help me with what I needed to achieve in order to avoid the same fate. He'd had a lot of questions, many of which I couldn't answer, but he was content with the answers I could provide him. We spoke about Aelric, how I felt about him now and how I'd been since coming back, and we agreed that, in order to move forward, I needed to stop looking back. And the only way I was going to be able to truly find a new fate was if I stopped being haunted around every corner. This included working on letting my feelings for Aelric go eventually. I knew it would be tough and wouldn't happen overnight, but we both knew I wasn't going to be able to become beta if I was terrified of the very alpha I was pledged to. I could see this would be the hardest part of my journey, learning to accept what had happened to me and trying to move forward. And so, the next day, my father went to Alpha Titus to propose a meeting be held in order to discuss the current beta heir position, mentioning also that I would be present. I was told he was extremely intrigued by the idea of me attending and immediately agreed for it to be scheduled in. In the meantime, whilst we were waiting for the big day to occur, my father and I had begun training after school and on weekends. I wasn't sure what he had ended up telling my mother, but he had somehow managed to convince her to let me drop Luna studies. Father and I both now knew that I didn't need the extra lessons, and it allowed me to spend my time preparing myself physically for the difficult road ahead of me. The only person who probably ended up unhappy with the new arrangements was my former Luna studies tutor, Helen Stewart, who had been enjoying the easy paychecks up until recently. I also found my father definitely lived up to his reputation when it came to fighting. His lessons were informative and I saw myself making the progress I'd so badly been lacking the last few months without Kai. And though their fighting styles were completely different, I eventually was able to adjust to my father's techniques with ease. He pushed me further than Kai ever had, and I appreciated that he didn't go easy on me. One of the most vital ways I was going to succeed in this crazy endeavor to become beta was if I could, by some miracle, prove my merit in battle, that I was just as good as a male heir. And then the day of the meeting arrived. It had taken over a month to find a time in the alpha schedule where he was free for smaller matters, and I found myself incredibly nervous to be facing him. I stood outside the meeting hall doors with my father, staring at the wood as if it could somehow show me what was waiting for me on the other side. We both knew how much would be riding on this discussion today. You don't need to be so anxious, my father said to me. You've done things far more nerve-wracking and crazy than this before. I knew he was right, but somehow it still felt like one of the biggest moments I'd had in either of my lives. I couldn't help but feel sick. Hey, he said, making me look up to meet his eyes. Just show them who you are and what you're capable of. You have nothing to worry about. I clenched my jaw and nodded at him. I could do this. He pushed open the doors, and inside I was surprised at what I saw. It looked as if this meeting wasn't just going to be a small chat with my father and the alpha. No, there were several key figures here, leading me to believe this was a far more serious affair than I had anticipated earlier. In their usual seats sat the elders, including Elder Luke, who gave me a small nod when our eyes met. However, standing before the council to the left was my Uncle William and cousin Alexander. My Uncle William looked so similar to my father it was almost uncanny, the only difference being his usually very sour personality. He'd made almost no attempts at being a part of my life growing up, and so I wasn't surprised to see that it took potentially robbing his son of a rank for him to get up and meet with me. I honestly felt bad for Alexander at times. Suddenly, the doors behind us opened, and Alpha Titus walked in, followed by Aelric. The usual fear that tightened in my chest had constricted at me per normal when I saw him, but I could feel it wasn't as bad today. It looked as if talking to my father had helped somewhat, even if it was just to help stop me from wanting to run away immediately at the sight of him. We all bowed our heads in respect at their approach and waited until they were seated. All right, Titus said in an oddly excited tone. Shall we get started then? Chapter 36. Alpha. Titus smiled between Alexander and I, clearly eager for whatever was about to ensue. I couldn't help but squirm a little under his gaze. Naturally, my father had to leave me to sit by Titus given his rank. I watched him go and tried to not outwardly express just how nervous I was about him leaving me. But he needed to show he was unbiased in this decision, and I needed to show that I didn't require my father to fight my battles for me. Okay, Arya, Titus started. Why don't you begin by telling us why you're here today? It was clear by those selected to attend today that they all knew already what I was about to say, and yet he wanted to hear it from me anyway. Once again I found myself having to tread carefully, stuck in the game I knew Titus was laying out for me. I knew he wanted me to become Luna, but I didn't know yet what he thought of my desire to be Beta. Would it be enough for him to feel I was contained and not a threat? Or did he see through my plan to make myself immune, trapping his son should he ever cross me? Alpha. I'm here today to appeal a process that has for too long been an outdated tradition of our kind. I spoke out confidently. I knew if he sensed any weakness in me that it would be game over. I am here today to request you hear out my petition to succeed my father in his role as Beta when the time comes. There was a small murmur amongst the elders, but it wasn't their whispers that worried me, it was the feeling of a cold stare on me, something I was too familiar with. I spared a glance to the Alpha's right and caught Alaric's eye. As I'd thought, he wasn't happy with my announcement and was staring daggers at me. My natural instinct was to shy away and submit to his icy gaze, but I held my own, only breaking eye contact to return my attention to the Alpha. Definitely an intriguing prospect coming from you, young Arya, he mused. And Alexander? What say you about all of this? My son is the most qualified person in this pack to succeed my older brother. Upon his retirement, my uncle William replied. I believe I was asking Alexander, not you, William. Titus stared down sharply at my uncle enough to make him bow his head apologetically. The awkward silence that fell was only broken moments later by Alexander clearing his throat, clearly nervous over how badly this had already started. Alpha, it would be my greatest honor to support our pack by becoming Beta. One day, I am at the service of you, Aelric, and our fellow pack members. Titus inhaled deeply in thought, having listened to the replies on both sides. His eyes then turned back to me. Arya, tell me something, he said, reclining into his chair. The last time we spoke you mentioned having no desire for the Luna position, or any other role of substantial authority for that matter. What has finally changed your mind? I looked to my father and saw him nod at me in encouragement. My father has, Alpha, I said after a pause in thought. He has shown me the kind of strength I am capable of possessing and how my body doesn't need to define who I am allowed to become. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the entire truth. If it hadn't been for my father accepting who I was, who I am, and who I could be, there would have been no possible way I would be standing here now before Titus. His training over this last month had proven to me that I was capable of changing who I was, if I worked hard enough, that there was no reason to let others choose my fate. For me, not even a goddess. I am the only direct descendant of the House of Chrysalis, I continued. As you know, we have been the only family for hundreds of generations now to produce Betas time and time again. Our family's wits and strength have guaranteed our position, never failing in any challenge issued for our rank. It is our family's right to hand over this title to the next in line. Ridiculous, Uncle William called out. By your logic then, there should be no issue if my son takes over. We are your family too, after all. Your son is not the direct descendant of this house, I reminded him. I am. Alpha, you're not actually listening to this, are you? He laughed. There has never been a female Beta, and for good reason too. They do not have the strength required to defend the pack against larger male wolves. By extension, my Alexander is still of Beta blood, and has already begun his training over a year ago, to jeopardize our pack's safety for the sake of taking a chance on her is ridiculous. We have a perfectly good heir right here. He patted his son on the back, who looked embarrassed that his father was still speaking on his behalf. but I could barely pay attention to anything he was doing as my blood began to boil. His arrogance and blatant disrespect for me was evident. Without even knowing what I was capable of, he had already written me off for the sake of his own greed. He most likely only wanted his son to become beta to better his own chances of being accepted as an elder one day. I stepped towards him, a fire now burning within me, and spoke of the one thing I knew he would not be able to refute. It was something I had never wanted to use, something I had refused to invoke before now, but I knew that it was my best hope. When it came to breaking old habits of stubborn fools, sometimes you needed to take extreme measures. Need I remind you who I am, Uncle? I yelled out, a chill in my words. Instantly the room became dead silent. My sudden stride towards Uncle William had also been enough to scare him backwards, even though I was still several feet away. His face was no longer laughing. I am not some silly girl with hopeless ambitions as you may think. I snapped. I am Ariadne, the saintess, the marked, the chosen. I was selected by the goddess herself, and a piece of her lives within me. I embody her will, her desires. And yet you are here, merely an insignificant unranked member of our pack, trying to tell me that my succession is not possible because of the genitals I possess. His face had paled considerably as he stared at me, unable to make even a single reply. I laughed cynically at his pathetic appearance. I didn't realize our deities' decrees would be met with such exclusive prerequisites these days. Since when have we held more faith in outdated procedures over the word of our great Mother Selene? I was obviously embellishing the truth a little. The goddess Selene had made it clear her chosen fate for me was actually to be by Alaric's side as Luna. But it wasn't as if she was going to come down here and fact-check me herself, nor would there be anyone in this room qualified to disagree with me. The end of the day, she gave me the power to choose my own destiny, and this is what I had decided to do with it. I knew too well how she wouldn't interfere with the choices her children made, having lived through that abandoned hell myself. Finally, I was able to exploit that system for myself. Arya, Titus said warningly, you've made your point. I peeled my eyes off William's pitiful face only to turn back to the Alpha. So, it would seem we have an interesting predicament here, Titus continued, deep in thought. He then turned to my father, who had been watching me tear into William, a mild amusement in his eyes the entire time. Jared, I imagine you wouldn't have let her come in here today without having at least some trust in her capability to handle the job. So tell us, what is your personal experience with Arya that would persuade us to put our faith in her? My father turned toward me as he spoke. Her ability is commendable in almost all aspects, Alpha, he started. She has already proven to me in such a short amount of time that, not only does she hold an acute mind for all traits a leadership possess, but her talent in fighting has already far surpassed any expectations I could have possibly had. What good is your expectations when she will be knocked flat on her back the minute she is in a real battle, possibly even with a ranked male warrior? My Uncle William chimed in, finally having found his voice again. Unlike me, my father managed to keep his emotions mostly in check at his younger brother's tasteless remark, choosing to only narrow his eyes just enough that most would have missed it. She may not be as physically strong as your male fighters, sure, he replied, but I think you'll find that they will be lucky to just land a hit on her. Her agility and speed are like no other warrior I've ever seen. With continued training, I believe she may even become one of the best fighters in our pack. It's great to hear she takes after her old man, Titus said kindly, but before we get to making a decision on this, let's not forget to address one of the largest obstacles still here in this room. His tone and mannerism then suddenly changed almost instantly, scrutinizing me where I stood. Arya has been prophesied to not only be my son's mate, but has also been foretold to bring us great success should she accept that union. If we all choose to grant Arya her wish in this ambition of hers, then we must accept that we may lose that advantage as a possible side effect. Alpha, I interrupted, with all due respect, I have already given you my word that I will act only in the interest of the pack to see us succeed. There is no reason for any such union to be forced between Aelric and I when I am fully capable of fulfilling my duties, regardless of whether that be ranked or unranked. However, I feel becoming beta would be the best compromise for us both, would it not? I turned to look at Aelric and almost immediately regretted it. He was frowning in confusion, his eyes glaring at me. I wasn't able to stop the slight tremor that went down my spine, but I didn't have time to mull on his behavior for long as the Alpha spoke once more. Very well, Arya, he conceded. I will entertain the possibility that perhaps there is no real reason for you to be joined via mate bond. Perhaps the prophecy was misunderstood, and it was merely pointing at the fact you both would hold positions of power to lead us forward. Another murmur went out amongst the elders. I knew they didn't agree with this interpretation at all, some of them having been actually present at the time when they allegedly came to this revelation of my future. I think we will need to take this to a vote, Titus finally concluded. Arya. William Alexander. Please step outside for a moment whilst we converse. Both the discussion and the votes made from here on out will remain confidential from all involved parties. The three of us bowed and made our way out of the room. The entire time we stood outside the door, Uncle William regarded me wearily. I could tell he wanted to start an argument with me, his mouth opening and closing several times, but every time he was about to speak he would just deflate again. A part of me wanted to smirk at how cowardly his true colors were. Alexander, on the other hand, was silent, looking almost tired. I could only assume he was exhausted by his father's continued attempts to push something onto him that he seemed to not particularly care about. I assumed he was happy enough to accept the role, but he was lacking the same drive of ambition that I held. In a twisted way, it almost could be perceived as my uncle attempting to live through his son, wanting something for him that he had always been denied. I wondered if Alexander was ever able to free himself of his father. Over the years I became Luna. It felt like an eternity waiting for the council to decide. As every second ticked past, the more nervous I became. I ended up leaning against the wall, eyes closed in thought, while I reviewed everything that had just happened in my mind. However, next to me my uncle had begun pacing nervously, something I was finding increasingly more annoying by the minute. Some may say it was a good sign though, I told myself. If there had been a strong majority either way, then the negotiations would have been over already. The fact that it had dragged out for what felt like an hour now could only mean that they were having trouble reaching a final decision. And then suddenly the doors opened behind us. We all looked up towards the elder who stood there, their face completely emotionless. Thank you all for your patience, they said. You can come in now. We've reached a verdict. Chapter 37. We stood in front of the Alpha in silence as he glanced between Alexander and Thank you for waiting, Alexander. Arya, he started. I still couldn't read his face, his expression not giving me any hints to the results. The council and I have discussed this at long length, and the result was a die. My mouth opened in shock as I stared at Titus. A die? What did that even mean? For us then? It appears we were completely split in half, 5-5. And so, Alexander. Yes, Alpha? My cousin replied, straightening his back as his name was called. You may continue with your training for Beta. Yes, my uncle yelled out, ecstatic with the victory. I almost couldn't believe he had spoken so childishly in front of the entire council. But my heart sank at Titus' words. Had I really failed? In my head I instantly began to think of ways I could overturn the decision and have someone make a deciding vote. And if William would have let me finish, the Alpha continued, breaking my thoughts. Arya, you are to take up training also. Titus glared my uncle down as he spoke. We intend to have you both train for the position until Arya comes of age. Upon that time, both parties will undertake an exam and will also duel for the right to succeed as Beta. I couldn't help the small tug of a smile that played on my lips at this announcement. Whilst no one could disagree that the exam would be easy for me, I knew most here would think I was at a clear disadvantage with the proposal for a duel. My cousin, being 1 year older than me, would be seen to have the upper hand, having had at least a year to learn how to fight in his wolf form by then, something that takes time to master. Unbeknownst to almost everyone in this room though, I was already well acquainted with my wolf. It was true I wasn't a fighter in the past, but I had mastered moving in her body flawlessly over the 6 years I had been able to shift. I knew when she eventually came back to me that it would be like greeting an old friend. I had missed her dearly already. Of course, I would have preferred to have been given the title straight up, but this didn't seem like the worst compromise either. the exam would be a piece of cake, and a battle wouldn't be that difficult if I kept up with my training. If it meant working hard for another 3 years, then so be it. Would defeat my cousin, avoid becoming Luna, and get to see the heartbroken look on my uncle's face as I reigned victorious all at once. Everyone in the room was a little unnerved by my mildly pleased reaction, but I didn't care. I accept, I said calmly. I locked eyes with Titus as I said this and saw he had that same look of curiosity in them that I'd gotten to know so well now. The look that said he was eager to see what I'd do next, almost as if I was his favorite pet to watch. Well, I wasn't one to divulge the old man, but I certainly found his idea of resolving the dispute creative. And so that's how I became a probationary beta heir. Subject to approval. My life definitely became busy after that. Much to my disappointment, I still wasn't allowed to drop school to focus on more important matters. The only benefit of this was that it allowed me to still see Myra, someone who I'd otherwise be too busy to see regularly anymore. Every day after school and several hours over the weekend I now spent with my father, either training or learning about the new role requirements. Many of the duties for the beta seemed not too far off from the things I'd been looking after as a Luna. Because of this, I was picking up the differences very quickly. The rest of the time I wasn't in training or school, I was either attending council meetings or completing small errands, some of which were with Aelric. Typically the alpha and beta heir were meant to start working together from around the age of 16 onwards. Since I was still short of this age, most of his time was therefore spent with Alexander instead. I of course didn't mind in the slightest. But the times we did spend together I found were becoming slightly easier. With every meeting, I did my best to ignore how nervous I was around him by throwing myself into my work. And whilst I still jumped and flinched whenever he came too close, it was definitely a lot better than it had been several months ago. But, that being said, as much as I'd managed to improve, it still didn't stop me from leaving the very second we were done with whatever our task was for that day. By the time 5 months had passed, I felt like I was finally in a good place and had a clear path to achieving my goals. And so today I found myself with a day off, much to my surprise given my normally very busy schedule. My father was out of town on a beta errand and there were no meetings to be held for the day. I considered helping Lucy with managing some of the investments we'd recently looked into, but I'd forgotten. She was seeing the private investigator today and wouldn't be back until tonight. It was only the second time I'd ever had so much free time to myself, and once again I felt a little at a loss for what to do. But if it was true what people said and good things come in threes, I was hoping it wouldn't be the last time I'd get some of the much-needed downtime. With having nothing better to do and with no one to tell me otherwise, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to see Myra. Sure, I probably should have taken the extra time to do some training alone, but it was such a rare opportunity that I didn't even care. I'd been working so hard the last few months and felt that I deserved to treat myself. And what better way to treat myself than with junk food from a certain cottage café? Within 2 hours I was seated across from Myra with a plate full of fries in front of me. She stared at me with a fascination as I ate, her head resting against her hand tilted as she watched. You know, they have other options to eat, she said. I didn't even reply as I was too absorbed in the food before me. Having experienced it for myself now, I could see how junk food could quickly become addictive. She sighed. You are a marvel, Arya. Myra then began eating her own food, a sad-looking chicken salad. Probably was actually delicious, but it was the sort of food I was eating basically every day now. I still had a love and appreciation for it, but it wasn't enough to make me want to order it of my own volition. So what have you been up to? I asked, sipping at some sort of vanilla milkshake thing. It had random pieces of cookie in it and I wasn't sure what to make of it. Regardless of the weird addition, it still tasted nice, albeit a bit strange. Not much, she replied. To be honest, I've mostly been busy helping my parents out. But oh, actually. Her face changed, a small crease forming between her brows. I wasn't sure if I should tell you, she said slowly, but I heard from Kai the other day. He sent me a letter. I tensed up at hearing his name. Oh, was all I could say, now staring intensely at the milkshake in front of me. I hadn't prepared myself for her to say it, and so I wasn't sure how to react. I didn't want to sound too interested, but I couldn't lie that I had been curious over how he'd been going. We hadn't spoken about Kai since the last time we were here, as Myra knew it was a sensitive topic, but it wasn't as fresh for me anymore, and I reminded myself there wasn't any reason to get upset. I'd been doing great over the last few months, having much more important things happening in my life, but I still thought of him now and then. In fact, I had made several attempts at writing him a letter over the months he'd been gone, but every time I ended up throwing it out, having thought better of it. Based on the last time I saw him, I knew that if he wanted to talk to me, he would reach out himself. "And how is Kai?" I finally asked. She pursed her lips a bit to the side, trying to gauge my reaction. "He's going well. Busy," he said. "He's begun his full training for Alpha Air now." He asked how I've been and wanted to check in to see if everything was still going well here in the winter mist. I nodded my head absent-mindedly. "That's good." I could feel her eyes on me as she spoke, and I tried to act as casual as I could. But after what felt like at least a minute, she finally continued reluctantly. "And he asked how you were." I snapped my eyes up to her then, unable to now hide my interest. "Kai asked about me? And what did you reply back with?" I said cautiously. "I haven't replied yet," she admitted. "I was sort of procrastinating talking to you first." I inhaled deeply, thinking it through. Kai asked how I was. Did that mean he wasn't angry at me anymore? But if he wasn't angry, then why didn't he just send me a letter directly himself? Why would he go through Myra to find out how I was going? Was he just asking her to sound polite since he knew Myra and I were good friends? "You can tell him that I'm fine and leave it at that," I finally concluded. "Arya," she said, disappointed. "Wouldn't it be better to tell him what you've been up to? Maybe it'll help fix things between you two." "No," I said, a tone of finality in my voice. "If Kai wants to know how I'm going, then he can reach out to me himself. And I mean to me, not via a third party." She sighed. "You're too stubborn sometimes." I ignored her, concentrating on the small cookie pieces inside my drink as if it was suddenly the most interesting thing at the table. Myra ended up having plans for the afternoon, and so we finished up our breakfast earlier than I would have liked. The absence of having any plans left me with too much time inside my own head, mulling over things I would have rather moved on from. Or at least I thought that would be the case. Instead, I arrived back home only to find an attendant I didn't recognize in my house. "Saintess," they greeted me, bowing. I groaned internally at the title. "Yes. I have been sent today to inform you that you are to prepare yourself for dinner with the Alpha Heir," they said. "He will be arriving tonight at around 7 o'clock. My face paled. "Arriving where?" "Here," they confirmed. "You will be hosting the Alpha Heir here tonight at your residence for dinner." Well, fuck. Chapter 38. It had Alpha Titus written all over it. He had coincidentally chosen a night my father was out of town and my mother was shifted to work at the hospital. This meant it would be just me and Ilric. It seemed I had assumed incorrectly that Titus was done trying to play matchmaker with us when I had been accepted as a probationary beta heir. Naturally, I had thought the surprise dates would come to an end. Did he think I was going to fail in my endeavor to best Alexander? Or was this his idea that I could be persuaded to drop out of the running for the title if I fell for Ilric? Putting all of that aside, I now found myself with less than 7 hours to get the entire house ready. To have the Alpha or Alpha Heir come for dinner was considered a high enough honor already, but hosting Aelric would just make things more difficult. Never found him an easy person to please in my past. I worked tirelessly from the moment I found out he was coming to organize everything down to the most minute detail, from briefing the attendants on behaviors to avoid around him to creating a menu for the cooks so they could prepare Alaric's preferred foods. Nothing was left to chance. By the time I was finally finished organizing, I found I only had an hour for myself to get ready and dressed. And then finally the time came. As Aelric entered the house, I saw him pause a moment to take it all in. Wondered what was going through his mind and couldn't recall if he'd ever come here before. But judging from his face, he didn't remember either. "Greetings, Alpha Heir," I said, bowing my head. "Evening, Ariadne," he replied. I looked up and saw him staring at me strangely already. Had I done something off? I racked my brain but couldn't think of anything. "It's an honor to receive you tonight," I continued. If you'll follow me to the parlor, we can sit there while we wait for our meals to be ready. We walked into the large sitting area with 2 couches. I stood at the doorway, allowing him to move first to choose where he would sit. When he'd made himself comfortable, I purposely sat on the opposite couch with just enough distance, close enough to not be rude, but far away enough that I didn't have to worry about flinching at any of his sudden movements. So, how have you been, Ariadne? He asked finally after several moments of silence had passed. It's been a week since our last meeting? Yes, Alpha Air, I said. I've been well. Yourself? I've been good, he said, his face turning that same odd frown again. You can call me Aelric, you realize? You're a Beta Air now. The formalities are strange. Oh. So this was why he'd given me that look at the door. I'd found it easier to call him Alpha Air these last few months, the sound of his real name on my lips always leaving a bitter taste. I clenched my jaw, preparing myself. Apologies, Aelric. He regarded me wearily. Obviously, something else was still bothering him that he hadn't mentioned. But he didn't end up bringing it up as, not long afterwards, one of the attendants came in to announce dinner was ready. I breathed out a sigh of relief. At least having food in front of me would give me an excuse to not keep the conversation going if need be. We sat down in the dining room, Aelric at the head of the table, myself to his right, just as it always had been. I could feel the anxiety begin to creep into my chest at his proximity, knowing I was within arm's reach of him at any given moment. But I pushed it aside. I was stronger than that now. The food started to come out then, and I was grateful everything had been prepared exactly the way I had instructed. The spread was diverse enough for even 4 people, but I hadn't wanted to leave anything to chance. I looked up to check on Aelric to gauge his reaction, but he seemed completely fine. This being at least one comfort to my anxiety. Never know for sure though, since he was impossible to read. Is everything to your liking, Aelric? I asked. Yes, it's all great, he said. It didn't tell me much, but at the very least he hadn't hated it right away. And with that, we both began to eat. However, several minutes in, I realized he hadn't said anything and I was beginning to worry I'd done something wrong. I cleared my throat. So, how was your exchange? He looked directly up at me as he replied, and I tried not to jump at the sudden eye contact. It was good. I went to a northern territory called the Opal Tide. It's the central pack for the region up there. I wasn't overly familiar with them, but I knew they were a fairly powerful pack. Aelric had spared them during his tyrant years. I guess now I knew why. That's good, I said before taking another bite of my food. Ariadne, he said, trailing off. Yes. He looked confused, as if he wanted to talk about something but wasn't sure if he should. Never mind. He clenched his jaw and went back to eating his food. A part of me was curious and wanted to know what he'd wanted to say, but I thought better of pushing him for answers. We ended up eating the rest of our meal in silence after that. I wasn't sure what to talk about or whether I should even try to start a conversation or not, and so I let him be. When he was finally done, he placed his utensils on the table. That was delicious, thank you. Please tell the attendant they did a great job. I'm glad to hear that, I said, genuinely relieved everything had gone as planned. Do you think I could trouble you for a cup of tea? Oh, he wanted tea. I suppose I could make him some. I stood up and began walking to the kitchen. Ariadne, what are you? I stared at him confused. He said he wanted tea? I was getting him tea. Never mind, he said, leaning back into his chair. I paused another moment, still unsure over whatever that was, but then proceeded on my way to the kitchen anyway. I asked the attendant there to boil me some water as I prepared the tea leaves. They too gave me an odd look that I still couldn't decipher. Several moments later I was on my way back with his tea in hand, walking straight up to him. I was about to place it on the table in front of him when suddenly his arm shot out towards me. I jumped, not expecting him to have moved so quickly, and dropped the right onto his leg. He stood up immediately and cursed in pain. I realized too late that he had actually just been reaching for the cup in my hand, but I hadn't expected it. I hadn't thought he would move so abruptly. Oh goddess, no, was all I could say. Instinctively, I had already begun pacing backward until I found myself up against the wall. Please, no, I'm so sorry. He was patting at his leg with a napkin, wincing from the pain when suddenly, his eyes looked up to meet mine. I had messed up. I had messed up so badly. I'm sorry, please, I'm so sorry. I kept repeating, my body beginning to shake. It's fine, he said. But I could barely hear him as I was so scared over whatever he would do to me. He saw how I was, how my face had completely paled. I said, it's fine, Ariadne, he repeated with a tone of irritation now. And then he started walking towards me, looking unsettled by my reaction as I continued to apologize over and over again. Are you not listening to me? What's wrong with you? I recoiled away, but there was nowhere to move. I was already trapped by the wall. And then finally he'd had enough. Why do you always have this reaction to me, Ariadne? He snapped, frustrated. I don't get it. What have I done to you? What could I possibly have done to always make you fear me this much? I stared at him mutely, unable to find my voice. Before you became Beta Air, we literally had only spoken maybe 5 times. Growing up. So what the hell did I do? And then I saw him. Really saw him for the first time since coming back. This wasn't the adult man who had gone on a killing spree. This wasn't the man who had trapped and used me. This was a teenage boy who was probably still learning who he was himself. He had the same midnight curls and green eyes, but his face didn't have the same lines from battle he'd acquired over the years. He was younger, purer. I'd been so caught up in the past that I'd been unable to look at him in the present. Help me understand, Ariadne, because I can't take it anymore. He looked at me then with a sad desperation, as if this had been something piling up inside him for a long time now, because whenever I look into your eyes, all I see is a reflection of myself seen in the form of some kind of monster, and it makes me feel sick, like I need to be apologizing for something when I don't even know what I did wrong. I wanted to say something to give a plausible explanation for why I was so scared of him, but there was no good reason I could think of that didn't involve telling him about my past life. What could I possibly tell him? Because he glares at me in meetings? Because he was sarcastic at me that one time? Because he gets angry when other men carry me off? Ariadne, please talk to me, he said and grabbed at my arms gently. Help me understand what it is I've done. I'm sick of having to feel disgusted by myself whenever I'm near you. What did I do, Ariadne? I couldn't focus, I couldn't think anymore. My head was spinning. And my vision was beginning to blur. I realized what was happening, but it was too late. I was having a vision. I clenched my teeth to hold it off as long as possible. I knew I couldn't let him see me when I eventually appeared to pass out. Too many questions I didn't want to share answers to. Ariadne, he called again, still waiting for me to reply. He didn't even realize anything was off about me. Ulrich probably just assumed I was ignoring him. But I could barely see him now, struggling against whatever it was that caused the visions. It was pushing at me, trying to overpower my body, but I held on as much as I could. I shook my head. It was the only thing I could muster, as there was no way I could reply with actual words. Not now anyway. He sighed in annoyance, finally letting me go. I don't know why I even tried to organize dinner, he said before I heard his footsteps begin to leave. Ulrich. Organize the dinner? Not Titus? I didn't get time to think on it further though, as suddenly I felt myself falling and my eyesight evaporate. And then there was blood. So much blood. All over me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The hot sticky sensation on my hands I knew could only be one thing. I was sure that if I looked down that I would find it everywhere. But that wasn't all. I was standing with the weight of someone leaning against me, their neck against my shoulder. I couldn't see their face or even their head, but I could feel they were heavy. And then I realized this wasn't like any other vision I'd had previously. No. I wasn't watching it happen to someone else this time. I was here, present at that moment. This was happening in my future. But it was strange though. It was like my vision was frozen, a snapshot in time, allowing me a moment to get a grasp on what was happening. Couldn't move or speak, and everything around me was eerily paused in motion. I tried to keep calm and looked around, hoping to figure out where I was, but I didn't recognize the area at all in the dark. I could only see the tree line of a forest and a pathway leading from a dimly lit area at night. None of this was helpful. Suddenly, the person against me groaned out in pain and everything began to move again. Time having resumed. They grabbed at my shoulder and pushed themselves off me, falling to the ground in front of me. And then I realized what was happening, what my vision was showing me, because in my hand was a knife, a hot, sticky knife that had caused the source of all the blood. And in front of me lay dying Aelric, slowly bleeding out. I understood why I was here this time, why I was a participant and not a spectator. Because I was going to kill Aelric.